Hi everyone, I'm Mike Burke, Assistant Director of the Fort Pitt Museum, here to talk to you today about one of the most important objects in our collection. It's a carved powder horn with a depiction of Fort Duquesne at the forks of the Ohio River, better known today as Pittsburgh. Now you may be asking yourself, what is a powder horn and how is it used? Well, to be brief, a powder horn is a container made from the horn of a bovine animal like a cow or even a bison, and it's used to carry gunpowder in the 18th century. Back then, the bullet or the lead ball that was the projectile was carried separately from the powder charge. This is different from the way modern firearms work, where everything is contained in a single cartridge. Because powder horns were holding such a big quantity of gunpowder, you needed to keep that gunpowder safe from sparks and free from moisture, and the horn, which is essentially an air and watertight container, was a very effective way to do that. We'll have another video that talks about how powder horns were made and used in the 18th century, but for our purposes today, the other important thing to remember about powder horns is that they were frequently canvases for self-expression of their owners or of other artists. This comes in the form of carved decorations that are applied to the surface of the horn, and the Fort Duquesne powder horn that we're looking at today is a perfect example of that. In terms of why this powder horn is so important, it's all about the depiction of Fort Duquesne that we see here on the surface of the horn. Fort Duquesne was a French fortification that was built here at the forks of the Ohio River in 1754. Prior to the arrival of the French, a small group of soldiers from the colony of Virginia had erected a little fort here at the point that was later known as Fort Prince George. And no sooner had they finished this structure than the French arrived from the Allegheny with a far superior force and effectively evicted them. The French built Fort Duquesne soon after. Though it was a very stoutly built little fort, it was always too small for the number of soldiers that the French needed to station here at the point. And so in 1757, they did what any good army would do. They started to build an addition. And we see that here in the form of this long rectangular structure that projects from the northeast side of Fort Duquesne. In the 18th century, this is called a hornwork, or sometimes referred to as the second fort. And this was a place where the French stationed their additional soldiers and officers in barracks that lined both walls. Now, you may be saying to yourself, that's great, this is a French powder horn with an incredibly rare depiction of a French fort, and it was probably carved by a French soldier here at the point in the French and Indian War. But I think there's actually more here than meets the eye, because what we see in this configuration of Fort Duquesne is that it's exactly as the fort appeared when the British Army under General John Forbes arrived to take control of the point from the French in November of 1758. In addition to this depiction of Fort Duquesne and the way that it's laid out, there are some other clues in the engraving that tell us that this powder horn might have been made by someone other than a French soldier during the French and Indian War. The first is the appearance of this lion at the forks of the Ohio River, and this is something that in the 18th century was a well-known symbol of Great Britain. We also see near the base of the horn a deer bounding through what appear to be flames. This is actually consistent with British accounts from the Forbes expedition of when they arrived here at Fort Duquesne. The French had blown up one of their powder magazines and set fire to many of the other buildings in the complex. And so the appearance of flames here at the base of the horn is very consistent with those British accounts of their arrival at the point. We also have another clue on the reverse side of the horn, and that's the name G. Byler. Now, Byler is not a very French-sounding surname, it's a Germanic-sounding surname. And in fact, it's still somewhat common in eastern Pennsylvania today. Up here near the spout end of the horn, we also see the initials GB, presumably for G. Byler. Another interesting thing to note about how this horn was carved is that in the 18th century, there are actually two main ways that you would carve a powder horn. The first is with a knife, and that's something that almost every soldier has in his pocket. When you drag a sharp knife through the surface of the horn, you leave a very thin line. And if we could look at that up closely, we'd see that there are two little ridges on either side of that line that are displaced material. The other way to carve a powder horn in the 18th century is to use a tool called a graver. This is a little faceted tool that you push through the surface of the horn. This is used to carve primarily soft metal like brass or silver. When you push the graver through the horn, a small spiral of material rolls out in front of it, and you're left with a V-shaped trench. When you roll the graver to one side or the other, you can actually vary the width of that cut, and you end up with a very beautiful result of these kind of dimensional looking cuts. It's very easy to pick out. Based on what we see on the Byler horn, we know for sure that this horn was carved with a knife or some other sharp object. And that too may point to the fact that it was made by a soldier as opposed to somebody who was more highly trained. There are also clues in the architecture or the way that this horn is made that tell us that it might be a British provincial as opposed to a French object. One of those is a lathe-turned walnut plug here at the base end that's got the remnants of a knob for attaching the shoulder strap. In the 18th century, this type of thing would have been produced in a shop setting. Now, in June of 1758, Henry Bouquet, who was the second in command to General John Forbes on the expedition, wrote to Forbes in Philadelphia asking him to procure some powder horns for the provincial soldiers on the expedition. Forbes wrote back a short time later that he was sending 48 dozen powder horns in 2 wagons for the soldiers. That's a lot of powder horns. And so to make that number of horns so quickly, they needed to have plugs that were turned on a lathe and applied very quickly and efficiently. In the 18th century, this type of technology, lathe turning, is indicative of something that was produced in a shop or a professional setting. They also needed a hole at this end to be able to dispense the powder. What's interesting about this powder horn owned by G. Byler is that the architecture is consistent with a number of other Forbes Road powder horns that were made between 1759 and 1764. Many of those also have the same type of lathe-turned plug, and they also have a feature up here near the spout end that we see on the Byler horn as well. And that is this hand filing or hand carving of the detail at this end. All of this was done by the end user or by some other soldier. This is not done in a shop in Philadelphia. The final clue about when and by whom this powder horn was probably made comes in the form of a manuscript map called a Plan of Fort Duquesne, now called Pittsburgh. It shows the French complex in great detail, and we think that it was made within days of the British capture of the point in November of 1758. In comparing the manuscript plan to the depiction of Fort Duquesne that we see on the G. Byler horn, we can tell that they're almost identical. What's also interesting is that the following year, in 1759, so very soon after the British capture of the point, another version of this map, an engraved version, appears in a German publication across the Atlantic. And so it gives you an idea of how quickly this information and this particular depiction of Fort Duquesne spread. In conclusion, while Byler's identity remains a mystery to us, we think he may have been a soldier or even a wagoner on the Forbes expedition that took control of Fort Duquesne on November 25th, 1758. One of the first things that John Forbes did when he arrived here at the point was to rename the site from Fort Duquesne to Pittsburgh after William Pitt, the Secretary of State for Great Britain at that time. And that means that the G. Byler powder horn with this depiction of Fort Duquesne may very well be the oldest surviving object to have been made in Pittsburgh. Now part of the permanent collection here at the Fort Pitt Museum, the G. Byler powder horn is a must-see for anyone who's interested in French and Indian War material culture or early Pennsylvania objects. The Fort Pitt Museum is located in historic Point State Park, and we're open daily from 10 to 5. If you like videos like these, we encourage you to subscribe to our YouTube channel. And if you ever find yourself at the forks of the Ohio River, we encourage you to stop by and see us in person. Thank you. Now part of the ferment. One thing that's comparable to a lot of, where should I take that back? If you like content like this, we encourage you to all right,
The rest of it's fine.
one more time. That'll be in the outtakes.